My name is Karen Hill, and I'm in Victoria. Today's the 3rd of April, 1984. I'm interviewing today Mr. Bob Burnham. This is the Oral History of Social Work in Canada project of the Canadian Association of Social Workers. Mr. Burnham, in order to get started, I wonder if you might tell us when and where you were born, and a little bit about your early background.
I was born in Vancouver in 1921. Attended school there and also continued on into university for 3 years. Following that, I worked at what was called at the time the Boys Industrial School, and that was just at the end of the war. And worked there for 2 or 3 years, and then transferred over to the welfare department. I'm not sure if you're interested in all the names. I went through a series of name changes over the years, but stayed with them for the balance of 35 years. And in 1950, I went back to UBC and took social work training. And then, 76 rather, I went to UVic, where I took management training, public administration. And so that was the extent of the education. In the department, I worked in the field for many years as a social worker, supervisor, regional manager. For the last 15 years, I've worked in the Parliament buildings here in Victoria.
To go back a little bit to your early days, were you in Vancouver during the Depression?
Yes, as a child. That's right. And attending school. And just old enough to start trying to find summer jobs. And having a feeling of the desperation of trying to locate employment, even part-time. The lineups were there, people seeking employment. But it certainly gave you, although you weren't depending on employment, you were hoping to get some for extra money going to school. And it certainly gave you the feeling that how awkward and desperate you could feel seeking work at that time. I guess people are going through that right now.
Yeah, it seems to be. Did you find work then?
I worked with my father, he's a contractor, so I did work with him most of the time in the summer months.
Where were you when the war broke out?
At university. And then when I did go to join up, I found I had an infected ear, so that stopped after.
So
I had no war experience, whatever.
Did you continue at the university then?
Yes, yeah. And then left there to, I worked for a year in a war plant, an aircraft plant, and then worked after the war cooled off. I moved then out to what was called Brown Lake School. It was just a school for kids who were committed by the courts.
Is this the school that later became or was known as the Boys Industrial School?
Yeah, Boys Industrial School, and then became, did I call it Brown Lake? And then it transferred over the island, it was called Brown Lake School, sorry. But it was the Boys Industrial School initially.
I see. When you started to work there, what were you doing?
Oh, just supervising boys groups in their group activities. They had, of course, different programs, the one being educational, the other was recreational and instruction. And I was on the recreational side, which included sports, from swimming and club activities, how to fill in their time constructively.
Had you had previous experience working with kids?
No, I haven't. Well, very minimal.
How did you find that, working with delinquent boys?
Very interesting, and it's very demanding, and of course without some kind of training, it was not that easy. But they did have some very good supervisory staff, which made it much easier.
Who were you working with there?
Hugh Christie was this assistant superintendent, a very capable man, and Kyle Stevenson. I don't know if you've met him. They were the people I counted on for construction.
How long were you there for?
I just trying to, I must have been 2 years. I'm just not sure, but roughly 2 years.
And then, what did you do after that job?
Well, then I had a contact from the welfare department at the time, and they had an in-service training program. While at the school, of course, you would be writing notes on boys as to their progress and what was going on in their lives. And of course, they had social work staff there who used these reports. And one of them did transfer into the field service and then phoned me and to see if I was interested. At that time, there were very few people available to fill the position, of course. They were seeking anyone that would apparently had some kind of abilities to go into the ministry. They provided you with in-service training, and that's how I got started.
Who was it that knocked on the door there?
Anna Faust,
Mm-hmm.
F-A-U-S-T. I just don't know where she is right now, but she was the one that started.
Yeah.
Mimi Lee interviewed me in the ministry. She was assistant director at the time.
What did you think about the possibility of becoming a social worker? How did that
Oh, it
sound?
was very appealing because I had taught with social workers in school. And the content of the job was obviously very, very interesting and appeared to be very constructive. So it caught the imagination. There's no question as to the interest it would generate.
Mm-hmm. So you started in-service training then. What was that like?
Well, this was put on in Vancouver, and half of your time was spent in the field, getting experience, and the other half in class. And that went on for 6 months. Following that, and then, of course, in the in-service training, you had various people from the ministry coming and talking to you about all the categories of work you were involved with. UBK, for example, child welfare, and others from the income assistance end of it. And anyone that was in Vancouver at the senior level usually came in and spoke for at least an hour, so you become acquainted with them. So it was a get to know as well as picking up as much knowledge as possible during that period of time. Following this, of course, they set up a bursary system. They offered around some of $1,200 to assist you going back to school. So I managed to get that in 1950 to take training at UBC.
So you were at the, was that for the master's program then?
No, that was just for the 1 year. The master's was another year, which I couldn't afford to take. By that time, I had a family.
When you were at UBC, do you have a recollection of the kinds of courses that you had?
Yes, I'd have to search a little, research child welfare legislation, casework practice, field work. They had found positions for students in the various agencies in Vancouver. Mine happened to be in the family court situation. I can't think of the other courses just offhand. It was a fairly substantial course. My criticism at the time was that the teachers didn't quite seem to have a grasp of what was going on in the field, to the extent that they weren't able to give a positive feeling to students about moving into the field in such a way where they would have a nice impact. At the time, the students came out and were highly critical of in-service classes. They felt the whole staff should be filled with trained social workers, almost doing every category of work, which in a sense now has proved a fallacy, because you can have many levels of staff in the field doing different specified jobs. But at the time, there was quite a lot of feeling about it, and it didn't generate positive action whatsoever. In fact, it had such an impact that, politically speaking, or the politicians in general, didn't trust the school, didn't trust the students in the school. And as I say, when that happens, that's just foolish.
Mm-hmm.
That's-
Had something happened that some public issue or something that
Well,
was?
always the trained staff were after more and more staff. And you had a conservative government, at least with social credit at the time. And they were going a long way in increasing the staff every year, but slowly. But it was never enough for many trained people. And again, they didn't really have a proper historic perspective. I don't think they saw what the problems of government were at the time and the allocation of resources. And so they came out pretty hot and heavy in opposition to anything the government did or didn't do.
Mm-hmm.
And, as I say, you eventually build up a terrible mistrust between the politicians and the school, and that was most unfortunate.
Indeed, it would be. And at the time that you were a student, were the students conscious of difficulties in maybe getting government jobs or all this?
No, there was no problem in getting government jobs. As many students as the school could produce, they were absorbed in the agency or the public service. Again, there was... Now, before I go any further, let me say that the morale in the ministry at the time was as high as anything I have ever seen. It was absolutely marvelous. We worked extremely hard, many, many hours of overtime, and the enthusiasm was just boiling over.
Mm-hmm.
This was mainly from people who existed in the ministry, and the in-service class, they did a very good job. Amy Lee and Martha Moscroft were basically responsible for it. But they sent students out just, as I say, ready to chew up the countryside. And that's where the school missed the mark.
The school wasn't able to generate, or
Well-
wasn't interested in generating.
Well, I think that the individual teachers were wrong in their perspectives. They did not sort of outline carefully where things were at. They didn't instruct their students how to go out, how to be helpful. I mean, if you've got staff out there that could use their expertise, well, for heaven's sakes, put them in the mood to give it, and be helpful, not destructive. And
Bob, how could you give us an example of how that destructiveness might show itself? It's hard for me to understand that.
I
so
see.
You're 40 or 30 years later.
well, first of all, a student with this sort of attitude will come out to the field office and immediately adopt a superior attitude to the in-service worker. And that, of course, doesn't go down. And it's a very subtle thing, but it was there. They would offer criticism always of the standards of work. They would offer terrible criticisms of the fact that some untrained person would be handling some rather delicate social situations. But handle it they must, they were the only ones there to do it. You must understand the school was producing all the students they could, and there still were not enough. And the office staff, or the office positions, field positions had to be filled, so they were filled with the best people they could find, with as much exposure to social workers as they could give them. And that was what was not grasped.
Mm-hmm.
And strangely enough, a sensible, intelligent, well-educated student couldn't understand that. They simply flailed out at the government and flailed out at some of the staff. So there was friction in the field part of the time. But in spite of this, there was still tremendous feelings of marvelous morale.
Mm-hmm. Had you been working in the field in the time between you'd done the in-service training and the time you went back on bursary?
Yes, I worked 4 years with in-service training and then went back on bursary.
Where were you working at that
At
period?
Kamloops, mainly. Small town in the interior of British Columbia.
What were you doing?
General service work. It was covering every category of work over a very large area. Be away a week at a time travel.
Mm-hmm.
So you were very much on your own. And at that time, unfortunately, strangely enough, there were no manuals to refer to, and there were no field supervisors. It was all done from the buildings. You did it by correspondence, and or telephone.
What are the buildings?
I'm sorry, the Parliament buildings in Victoria. Here's where all our central offices were. We had a lot of experienced staff, for example, in what we call the Financial Assistance Division and Child Welfare Division, Family Service Divisions, and so forth, and for assisting with our financial problems in dealing and handing out checks and so forth, the accounting offices. And you had to contact them for instructions very often.
Where's Kamloops from Victoria?
It's about 500 miles from Vancouver in the center, southern interior.
So you were really on your own then?
An awful lot, yes. And then I think I was about 2 years in Kamloops when we had a supervisor placed there. And this was an experienced person with training, and that helped fantastically, of course.
Who was that?
Winnie Burkhardt.
Mm-hmm.
And she's living in Vancouver now since retired.
How did the availability of that supervisor make a difference for you and what you were doing?
Well, I found the impact mainly on philosophy, the attitudes to certain problems, how to handle cases, what the ministry would expect me to do, how kind of supervision you offered to foster children, how often. She's tried to not only educate, but give you a better feeling for how to approach different problems.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you realize when you're in the field, especially when you're alone, you can feel the pressure from police who expect you to do something in a particular situation. They might refer, or doctors, or lawyers, or teachers. And an awful lot of pressure comes on. And when you're inexperienced, you feel that keenly, and you're just not quite sure what to do. Well, when you get an experienced supervisor, you can imagine how helpful that would be.
Mm-hmm. Any case examples, Bob, about your experiences in Kamloops?
Oh, yes, many. When I was first there, I recall I had the police on to me about a family where the children were being what they considered badly neglected. So when I got involved with this, it finally ended up that we had to take one or two of the children into care, and I didn't know the procedures. Some of the forms I hadn't seen before. So I had to take what I considered a common sense approach to deal with it. And while in court, the judges were very helpful at the time. So we resolved the issue as best we could, as I say, in as common sense a way as possible. But after the court hearing, then I had to phone Victoria and get the proper documentation. It was very, very awkward and most embarrassing, but this is what she faced. Another occasion I remember going down to a small town called Ashcroft and introduced myself to the police, teachers, doctors, and so forth. In small towns, they do want contact, or did want contact with you, obviously. And they all referred to this one specific family. And, you felt keenly the pressure that you must do something. And so you feel under this community pressure. And when you visit the home, you have to back off, try to look at the problem constructively, and remember, you're green as grass, you haven't gone through this before, and you're not just going to snatch kids and run off with them. And now this sounds really very basic, and in today's world you wouldn't run into it because most of your staff are coming up with some training. But here's the situation that you can realize a young new person is under tremendous pressure from the community. You want to show that you're able to handle something. And strangely enough, I knew that my mind was just in a whirl. So anyway, I went off by myself to think about it, and this marvelous revelation that I wouldn't do anything except try to work with the family. This sounds ridiculous now, but at the time it wasn't. So then I went back to all the people who had referred it and said that I appreciated their advice. And would they possibly help in every way possible, I would be visiting the family. I'd keep in touch with them, and we would try and rectify the situation and improve on it, rather than consider taking the kids out, which they had suggested. So it worked all right, at least to some degree. But that is the kind of awkward position you found yourself in. And Victoria's supervision then was obviously far too far away and too scanty. So when your local supervisor came, well, of course, you were well placed.
Mm-hmm. During those early years, Bob, working in small towns like that, was the issue of, or the principle or the idea of client confidentiality, those other kinds of ethical considerations, were those concerns that
Oh, yes.
were somewhere in your mind?
Yeah, very much. Yeah, that was in-service training that did reinforce all the critical items at the time. And yes, that was certainly one of them.
Mm-hmm. The other question that I wanted to ask you about that period of time is that social work has been, and I guess to a certain extent still is considered women's work.
Mm-hmm.
As a man in the field early on, did you, was that any kind of a thing that you had to think about?
Yes, it's funny. It is true. But when I started, there were a lot more men getting involved. And there were a number of men in the ministry at the time who were from the old relief department of the 30s. And they held the more senior positions, actually, like our regional director at the time, Fred Hazard, was a man. Winnie Urquhart, of course, was a woman. But no, in that particular office, finally, we had 3 men and 2 women. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But you did think occasionally, well, my involvement in work was considered women's work, but it was very light thought. It didn't really impact you at all.
Mm-hmm. Did you find yourself giving advice to women about how to raise their children and nutritious meals and public health concerns and things like that?
Yes, of course, we had a public health service at the time,
mm-hmm.
so we worked very closely with the nurses who were traveling the same district we were.
Mm-hmm.
And, yes, you were made acquainted with, of course, in small towns you knew everyone, so you knew of the existing services, whatever they might be, and you knew people personally, which helped tremendously, and you could seek their assistance as they could seek yours.
Mm-hmm.
It made it very easy because you knew them almost personally.
Mm-hmm. What kind of caseload would a person be carrying at that time?
Oh, they were huge. They were bigger before I started, but the first case was 350, constituting many old age pension type cases we visited annually.
Mm-hmm.
That was the administrative process as much as anything. One of the things sadly lacking at the time were resources for elderly children. We had only really foster homes for children. Problems existed then too, about which not too much was known. For example, child battering seemed to me our knowledge was gained a number of years later, or at least, for example, at university, School of Social Work, I don't think they ever mentioned child battering.
Was it happening?
Obviously, it was happening, and I had one case referred, and it's a very, very complex situation, but nothing to fall back on at the time in the form of literature. So that was a coming thing. So there were problems you ran into which were puzzling and about which you felt totally helpless.
Mm-hmm. What would be the most prevalent social problem that you would run into at that time?
Well, the one that was in the way of problems, you mean in numbers?
Yeah.
Well, really, it was families on assistance. And of course, the assistance levels were bare subsistence. And coupled with that were all the problems inherent from getting sufficient clothing and proper child care and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
The ones that posed you the greatest problem were your neglect cases and children that you had in care,
mm-hmm.
because they had many problems.
Mm-hmm. In the Kamloops area, Duke of Wars at issue?
No, that was later when I was regional manager in Nelson. The Duke of Wars were in progress. They were, problems existed with them when I was in Kamloops and in Cranbrook, but I wasn't in direct contact with them. When I finally went to Nelson, the problem had simmered right down. It was very, well, was non-existent at the time. Although some of the kids were in the schools, they established, as you know, a boarding school for some of the children, and some were still in this boarding school when I lived in Nelson, but they were quietly transferred back home, and so the problem had simmered down considerably.
Okay, you were in Kamloops.
4 years, 5 years.
Confused on the time, on the
5
times
years.
now, on the sequence. Where did you go after you were in Kamloops?
Well, after university, I went back to Kamloops, and then I supervised at Tronc Hill, which was a TB institution at the time, and I was there for 1 year. I found it lacked the life of the field, and longed for the field again, and finally I was transferred up to Cranbrook, where I supervised for 4 years.
Mm-hmm. How is it different being a supervisor from being a field worker?
It was a very pleasant change, and that you felt, by that time I'd had a reasonable amount of experience, and you're able to pass on your own experience and expertise, which hopefully I developed by that time.
Mm-hmm.
And it was very rewarding.
Mm-hmm.
Here again, the morale was still very high, and some of the staff who were getting were units to train, others were still in service. But that kind of work is, you feel your impact is quite dramatic. My own experience with a supervisor when Winnie Urquhart first came was such that I knew the value of it, and therefore the satisfaction.
Mm-hmm. What were some of the issues that were predominant at the time, during the time that you were in Cranbrook?
Child welfare problems were being more clearly identified, and in this province particularly, the needs for resources. As you know, the historic pendulum had swung from institutions years ago to every child would go into a foster home in the field. And then we realized that a lot of them couldn't be handled in foster homes because we were moving from one to the other because of behavior problems. And so then we spent an awful lot of time developing special kinds of resources for these children, be they in the community or centrally located, down usually in the Vancouver area. Also, the needs of the aged were becoming more and more dramatized, really. Families were taking less responsibility for them and expecting government to do something. And it was around that time government started to construct care units for the aged.
About when would that have been?
Well, that would be the mid-50s. And by this time, of course, the economy was picking up at a great rate, and there was not much more money available. So we, year by year, were given more allocations for these resources, shall we say, as alternatives to home care. And again, the historic perspective, once you have an institution, for example, we had many elderly people in the community that had broken down to the point where they couldn't care for themselves. And neighbors, doctors, even police were involved trying to look after them. And the general feeling was then that government must assume responsibility for them. Not so much families. Families were becoming rather neglectful and didn't see it as being their basic responsibility. And so we were obliged to take steps to see that they were cared for. Home care programs weren't available, so we did use institutions of various sorts. And now, of course, in the last dozen years, much more attention is being paid to home care welfare services, and that end of it has grown tremendously.
What kinds of institutions would have been available for the aged at that time?
Well, of course, for the ones who didn't have the mental capability of looking after themselves, they did have units for these people, or for people with that problem, and others who were bedridden at a different level, and then others who were ambulatory but not able to look after themselves. At Kamloops, they did have what was called they called it the old man's home at the time, and it was for elderly men who were ambulatory, but they were not able to look after themselves.
Mm-hmm.
That had been in existence for years there,
Mm-hmm.
but that was expanded to accommodate more people.
Were there social services available at that home?
Limited, very limited, because again, there'd be no social worker placed there. We handled it in the field office. We handled admissions as see if there's a child probably out in the sticks who couldn't look after himself. We would interview him and the doctor and see if he was a candidate for the provincial home, and then we sent him the necessary information and documents to have him admitted. And generally after that, we go up to visit him
Mm-hmm.
to see if everything was going well. And of course, the superintendent or the staff up there knew of your existence, and they would phone if there's anything. But we handled the social services for that particular institution from the district office.
So the services that would have been provided in that institution would have been more toward a medical and housekeeping sort
Right.
of nature.
Oh yes.
I see. During the time that you were in Cranbrook, were there other social issues that were hot items at the time?
Oh,
You had mentioned child welfare and care of the aged.
yeah, it's just the public, obviously, and properly so, we're becoming identifying child care problems, which initially I think they felt were things that belonged to the parents and not to them. But as time went by, I'm speaking about this particular community. I think in larger centers this had long passed, but in small communities the feeling still existed that it was none of your business. It belonged to the parents. Now I stand to be corrected here, but this was the impression I had. But it was through these years when they understood there was a welfare department and there were workers who handled this type of thing, then we started getting more and more referrals. Cases were being identified that had never come to light before,
Mm-hmm.
just as has happened with battered children.
Mm-hmm.
So once they were aware of the existence of some kind of help for this kind of family, then we started. And the pressures were considerable because when a community referred a case, quote, they wanted something done about it. Usually in the form of removing the children if they posed a problem. So there was a tremendous amount of public education to be carried out. Otherwise, you'd be flooded with children being taken kids into care.
Mm-hmm. Were there a lot of kids taken into care?
Oh yes, and that was one of our problems. And you know, at that particular time, because of lack of resources and huge caseloads, you couldn't devote too much time to all the what we call neglect situations, so that the amount of work involved with the family wasn't sufficient. And you ended up taking kids into care. It's sort of the last resort, but you were obliged to do it. So we found the numbers of children coming into care every year was increasing. And then there was a determined effort to back off on this and to stop doing it and to impose pressures in the field to get children back home again and work with them. We had staff was increased annually to do this particular case especially. By this time, I was attending meetings in Victoria, and our ministers at the time, Wesley Black for one, was very hot on this issue.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to stop this flood of kids coming into care.
Mm-hmm. Who was the superintendent of child welfare?
Ruben McCabe. And here again, we had lots of discussions, disagreements, and agreements on what should be done and not be done in these particular situations. But it was a matter of trying to find a suitable balance so that we wouldn't overdo or flood our foster home with kids and really not do a decent service for the family to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Did you have an adequate number of foster homes?
Never enough. Never. I suppose today's the same. We're always seeking more.
Mm-hmm. Would kids have been, where would kids from Cranbrook, for example, have been placed?
Well, we always tried to place them locally because once you placed them in another area, you tended to forget them. It's a human factor, you think, oh, that terrible problem's gone away and you relax momentarily. But as supervisors, we started putting heat on workers to find their own foster homes and follow them up, and then see about getting the kids back home again. Never to make what would be considered a permanent separation unless it was obvious it had to be.
What kind of training and support was available for foster parents in those days?
It was a number of years before we had the foster parents organizations established, but the only real help they could get would be from, well, the local minister was helpful at times, but ourselves, the social work staff. That was the main thing. And then we started the organizations going, and I think they were particularly helpful in that they could all share common everyday experiences.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But apart from that, as I say, the only help they could get was themselves.
And were the caseloads as big as they had been when you were
They kept coming down slowly, and roughly, I think, by the time I was in Cranbrook, workers had less than 200, 150.
Mm-hmm.
And then we started to assign certain caseloads, for example, financial assistance, to workers who seemed to prefer that, and save our trained staff for the more difficult social problems.
Mm-hmm. Was that something that took place just in your area?
No, I think most of them were. We slowly moved in that direction.
Because BC had been in the forefront of developing the field service idea,
Yes.
worker,
Yeah.
and this was a move away from that. Eh?
Yes, it was, because there were a large number of old age cases and a large number of financial assistance cases which really didn't require the expertise of a trained social worker. And we did identify, of course, very keenly the need of families and neglected children especially. So then we tried to assign our experienced trained staff to this particular area. The problems inherent with it are obvious. The large territories, you couldn't have people just traveling many, many hours out and back to every little spot. So usually in an area that was, when your worker was away for several days at a time, he would be good generalized, or she would be a good generalized worker and handle all categories. Locally, you could divide it and get special caseloads to each worker.
Yeah. Well, I guess that was the reason the field service had developed in the first place, was because of the geographic dispersion of the population.
Oh yes, in the beginning. Well, one of the interesting things here too, it's funny when you're talking, thoughts come to mind. But in the relief days, of course, in the 30s, each municipality had its own relief department. And then during the war, or just before the war, they started a small social work department where they did try to deal with family problems. But these were few and far between, and they would leave Victoria and travel up to different parts of the province to do these things, just have a few cases. Well, then eventually, the relief and the welfare department were brought together and sat in the same office, and the staffs were absorbed in different functions. And then the generalized concept was accepted. And then from there you move from, as I say, from being very generalized to some specific specialized caseloads.
Okay.
And just one other thing. It's interesting to note that the municipalities at that time were involved. Of course, under the Municipal Act, they were required to provide assistance to the indigent persons in their own areas. And this posed numerous problems. One, you'd have staff who had little or no knowledge whatever about problems of the poor, and they were administering assistance. It could be a local policeman. It could be the dog catcher, and it was in several instances. And it was a lousy system. And then, of course, if some poor soul in Cranbrook couldn't get work there and moved to Vancouver to get and couldn't find work and asked for assistance, they'd be given a ticket back to Kamloops. And they would move back and forth. So the government did identify that problem, and to deal with it, pulled the agencies together. For example, in Kamloops, the local relief office continued to exist for many years while we had a welfare office there. We handled the child welfare in the city of Kamloops. He handled financial assistance. But eventually, that office too was picked up and amalgamated. So that the whole area is handled. And then, of course, this whole business of obliging people to move from one area to the other was finished with. A financial arrangement was made with the municipalities that the government would pick up the lion's portion of the costs for public assistance, and they would pay a per capita rate. And so that eliminated all this residence business. Do you remember the old Residence and Responsibility Acts?
I've heard of them.
Yeah, so that was a marvelous thing to happen. And all this stupid pushing people back and forth stopped.
About when was that the law passed?
I wish I could remember. I'm sorry, I can't recall.
Because when the Canada Assistance Plan came in 66
Right.
or 67 or 65, so residence was,
Yeah.
even though it was still an issue in some provinces.
Oh, yes. And also the interprovincial, you get someone here from Alberta and you had to send them back, or to Saskatchewan, vice versa. And that's one of the great advantages of the Canada system.
Maybe that'd be a good place to stop for a few minutes. Yeah.
Right.
Okay, Bob. When we left off, we were discussing your work in Cranbrook, and perhaps you could tell us how long you were there and where you went after Cranbrook.
Yes, I was in Cranbrook for 4 years, and then laterally transferred to Nanaimo on Vancouver Island here, and where I worked as a supervisor for approximately 1 year, and then transferred to Nelson as regional manager.
And as regional manager, that was a promotion.
Yes.
And what were you doing in that job?
Well, this was overseeing. The original manager at the time had certain particular areas of authorization that he covered with field staff. That is, particular financial assistance programs in particular, where they required extra funds for some specific reason. It would be at the authority of the regional manager. The government at the time I remember the Premier telling me he didn't like these across-the-board kind of grants. For example, if there was to be a rental allowance, which he agreed to, he didn't want it across the board. He wanted it only on specific needy cases. Now that meant you had to send a specific report to the regional manager for authorization of this particular rental allowance. I don't know if I've made this clear.
I'm not sure I understand.
Well, the policy allowed for a family to receive so much money. The policy itself, and that's fairly clear as to the basic rates. But some family might come along and their rent had gone up inordinately high, and they were stuck. And they couldn't possibly pay that rent and still have enough left for food. So at this particular time, rents were escalating along with the economy. As it picked up and costs rose, so did rents. But the allowances weren't keeping up with them. So a lot of families found themselves in a particularly difficult situation. The landlord raised the rent to a level that they couldn't afford. There wasn't that much housing available, so they were stuck. And when we approached government then to increase the allowances because of the rental, the response then, and it was the Premier, said, no, not across the board, but I don't want any family to suffer, I don't want children suffering, but where there's a particular need, for example, in the high rents, then that will be authorized by the regional manager. So that meant that all these particular cases where there seemed to be a need for greater allowance to cover rent, this field worker had to write to the regional manager to have it authorized. Now this was fine when you have a few cases, but it became very burdensome when you had a lot. And of course it did grow and it grew quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And why did we bring this subject up? I've lost touch.
I was asking you how your job was it regional manager?
Yes.
Was different from what you had been doing before.
Yes. So in any event, it was you usually made trips through the region, talking with supervisors and staff, overseeing the various programs to see that they're handled adequately. You sampled cases. You discussed problems that the supervisors were experiencing with workers or with caseloads. When you saw a need for other kinds of service, such as upgrading of training for staff or specific training in some particular area, you had the authorization at times to set up conferences or training sessions for them. You were the contact of that particular region with Victoria, and we met in Victoria every 2 or 3 months to discuss local as well as provincial concerns. And this was a very important communication link with the authorities in Victoria.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned it in the instance of the rental allowances that your conversation with the Premier was how at least one way in which the policy was interpreted. Did that kind of thing often happen when Mr. Bennett was?
Well, Mr. Bennett was, as you know, a highly successful politician. And this particular thing actually occurred when I was in Victoria as assistant director. And at that particular day, Mr. Bennett phoned up to the deputy minister, who he liked and respected very much, Ray Rickinson. But Mr. Rickinson was away, and Jimmy Sadler, the director, was away. So the Premier's office phoned me, and I went down this particular situation. And what struck me was how often a political decision is made. And he asked me 2 or 3 questions concerning the unemployed, which I answered, and then I asked him if I could raise a crucial question. And he said this was in order. And so I raised the business because we had so much concern expressed in the field that rents were posing a terrible problem for families. And Mr. Bennett, I knew, had a particular feeling about children and that their needs were met properly. So I identified the particular need with the children, and then I learned that he had a tremendous knowledge of the workings of the ministry, inside knowledge. And as soon as I mentioned it, he said, fine. He said, take a look at this. He says, but not across the board.
Mm-hmm.
He his hands back and forth. He said, just let me know what roughly the cost might be, but make sure the regional managers authorize each specific case.
Mm-hmm.
And that was final. There was no discussing or debating that point. So many of we call these overages, special financial grants to recipients of public assistance who required extra money for some specific reason. We call them overages. And this was the way he liked them handled, although it did make a cumbersome administrative package out of it. But he insisted it be done this way, so it wouldn't get out of hand.
How did the Minister of Welfare of the day feel about the Premier's involvement in these matters?
Well, he was the boss, and I sometimes thought he knew as much about our workings of our ministry as did the ministers. He was a very bright, and he never forgot anything. And he, as I say, he knew Ray Rickinson, and he got first-hand information from Ray Rickinson all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And he trusted him. So that's the way he operated. Now, the minister of the time, they lived with that. And of course, Ray Rickinson would have praised the minister immediately.
Mm-hmm.
But it didn't seem to cause any problems at all.
Mm-hmm.
But, there was another occasion. When I was regional administrator at Nelson, we had a meeting in Victoria, and we had been called in on sort of an emergency basis. And what had happened, we were overexpending our vote on public assistance at a dramatic rate. And it was at a time when we had a surge in unemployment, and we had an awful lot of people coming in asking for financial help. It's sort of an uncontrollable thing. So we were going way over budget, and the premier was upset. When he got upset, everyone got upset. So we were called in. And Wesley Black, the minister, was there at the time of the meeting, and Ray Rickinson, our deputy. So we all expressed what was going on, and everyone had the same story. It was basically the unemployed who had no other means of subsistence. Well, then one of the regional administrators, Fred Bingham, stood up and he told this little story. And he said, this was in Abbotsford. We had a family, had 2 children, and these 2 children, when they went to school, had no lunches. Family parent couldn't afford it. So these 2 kids would hide out in the bathroom. And finally, this teacher discovered what was going on and reported to Fred Bingham. So a few minutes later, Mr. Black and Ray Rickinson left the room. And I didn't know it at the time, but they'd gone down to see the premier. And later, Ray Rickinson told me, when the premier heard this, bangs the desk, no one will go hungry in this region. And that was the end of the discussion about the over-expenditure on the vote.
Mm-hmm.
But up until then, it was a very hot issue. The premier would get angry, terribly angry at any minister that overexpended any vote. He was a strict, he kept his budget strictly in hand. He was a finance minister at the time as well, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
But I mention this simply because a lot of political decisions, big ones, important ones, this involved at the time millions of dollars, and they're made really on emotion rather than considered payment.
Mm-hmm.
But it's surprising. Several times that happened, and you realize that if you're going to present something to government, you better not put it out in cold, factual terms. Yes, those, but you've got to breathe life and feeling into it, or it won't work.
Mm-hmm. And that little story certainly made
Yeah.
a difference.
Oh, it was very dramatic. And I can't tell you the generation of concern that was the concern generated that meeting at the outset, and how it changed at that moment. Because when they came back up, it's just an entirely different picture. We never even talked about the over-expenditure again.
By the time you were in Nelson, you've been in the field for what, 10, 15 years or so?
Yeah, 15, I guess.
So you would have been there about 1960.
Mm-hmm.
Sometime around there. Over that period of time, had you been involved with the Social Work Association at all?
Off and on, yes. The difficulty with it was the meetings were always, or generally, held elsewhere. Mm-hmm. So our participation was really limited, mm-hmm. mainly by correspondence. It wasn't you could never felt part of it because you were too far away. You had to come down here to meetings. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it wasn't until you got down here that you could attend very many of the meetings. Mm-hmm. I wasn't that closely associated with it anyway. I didn't interact with it that much.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. How long were you in Nelson? Where did you go then after that?
About 4 years in Nelson, and then I went to Victoria. And I was regional manager in the island here for a year, and then moved into the buildings as assistant director.
As assistant director of
welfare. Title at the time.
How had it happened that you'd gotten that promotion?
Well, they're always put out for bids, mm-hmm. and they're posted, and you apply, and then you were interviewed. And then the the interview was done by the Civil Service Commission and representatives of the department. And just the usual interviewer asked a number of questions.
Had you had leanings toward these more administrative positions and getting out of the field?
I really honestly never wanted to leave the field, but salaries were poor, and I had 5 children, and I had to maximize my income. I didn't really want to move out of the field, no, but it was really necessity demanded it.
So what was it like as you started work as Assistant Director of Welfare?
Well, disappointing. It's not, well, for example, when you're working in the field as a supervisor or a regional manager, you have clear-cut areas of authority, and at that time you did. So you were sort of responsible for your own program, in a sense. Of course you had instructions, and you had to stay within certain limits, but the authorities you were given were very clear-cut. And it was, you felt, well, you're like a big frog, if you like, in a small pond. I hate using that hackneyed old expression, but it does describe it. And when you move into the buildings, you're really a small frog in a big pond and a cog in a wheel. And you lose that personal satisfaction. You do deal with areas which perhaps are a little more critical and important, shall we say. But you don't get the same satisfaction because there's so many things that are so slow in coming, and you're forever working on the same problem over and over and over. The problems that are presented to administration by the various ministers that come in are repetitive, and after a while they become exceedingly boring. Every minister that comes in wants to start a work program to get all the employables off the welfare. They all set up a job finders kind of a situation. They hire staff to find jobs. And I went through several ministers, and they all did exactly the same thing. They get rid of the one the previous minister had and set up their own. And you had to, you know, when you get a new minister, most ministers are a little distrustful of the bureaucracy. They feel, well, are these guys going to back me? Are they going to work for me honestly? Are they going to really support me and do a job for me or not? So you can't, when they bring up one of these ideas that we're going to get all the employees back to work, you can't say, look, we've tried this a dozen times before and you're wasting time. To win their confidence, you have to try to go along with it as best you can, give the positives, every positive you can, with the cautionary notes. But then later, when they have established trust and their confidence, then you can modify their suggestions. But the first one that always comes up, as you well know, is let's get all the employables back to work. Let's do this or let's do that. And it is tedious. It's that sort of thing that's particularly weird.
How did you, what ways did you find to deal with that kind of situation that occurred so often? The repetition, the same suggestion over and over. How did you find, how were you able to find satisfaction in the work?
My satisfactions were really gained from working with the field, which I was so familiar with, and establishing, you establish relationships with people in the field over a period of years, and you could develop good, strong, positive ones. That was where my satisfactions came. And trying to, for example, when the government had a change of philosophy or a change in policy, you could speak with them on the phone or correspondence and interpret this. The reasons why are so important. When they have to do something that they think is silly, if they can understand the reason for it, well, they can do it. If they don't, they just hate it and they won't do a much of a job. And I spent a tremendous amount of time in this way, trying to pass on the feeling or the thinking of government to the field, responses back and forth, to try and bring about a decent balance.
During the time that you were Assistant Director of Welfare, what were the responsibilities of your particular division or section?
Well, at that particular time, you had responsibility for the financial assistance department. You had a lot of responsibility with the hiring staff, personnel. Office came under you. and you had the regional managers reporting, well, almost directly to you, so that your involvement was heavily with the field, but you still had divisional responsibility, division in the form of the, as I say, the financial assistance department personnel.
Mm-hmm. So, issues like social assistance rates would have been something that was of your...
Right, that's right.
What was happening with social assistance rates over those years?
Always, even though the economy of the province picked up, the assistance rates kept going up, but always lagged behind. And comparatively speaking, the lot of the recipient didn't improve as fast as the wage earner. They always lagged way behind.
How were the advocacy and social planning groups that exist in BC, how were they relating to you about this kind of thing?
They were a little slow in coming, especially during that time. Where they did pick up was when the NDP government came in, and it was in power for a 3 or 4 year period. And they, of course, encouraged this kind of participation.
Mm-hmm.
Clients' rights became a big issue, and it was encouraged by our minister at the time, Ron Levy. He encouraged communities and individuals to contact him directly so he could get a feeling for the concerns that they had. Money revenues were pouring in, and I mean pouring in. The forest industry was going possibly the largest revenues we've ever had at that time, and the NDP spent right up to the maximum. They spent it all.
Mm-hmm.
Built one program there, home care for the aged, homemaker services, nursing home services, homemaker services, in the various special classes for kids in schools, problem children, child care resources. They just multiplied tenfold.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have many resources inside of a few years that we have been seeking for many other years before that.
Mm-hmm.
And along with it came the demands of clients, which took a very much of a leap forward at the time.
Would that have been the time that the Federated Inequality Group got started?
Yes.
And that sort of thing?
Yes, at around the same time. Mm-hmm. The unfortunate thing, I think, that happened in the early days, a lot of common sense decisions were left for field staff. And that's always dangerous when you have a public service, that some public servant, some pen pusher, if you like, is left to make decisions about a particular person on a common sense basis. Mm-hmm. But our act at the time was very small, short. It was a positive act, and it was a good one in its day.
So your Social Assistance Act?
Yes. Mm-hmm. And the regulations were limited in size. Our policy manual was compact enough so you could handle it. But when the client's rights were being very much considered, and rightly so, they wanted a rule for everything. So the Social Assistance Act was rewritten, and it became just onerous in size and scope. You had to establish rules for everything. And as you know, for every rule you make, you have to make several more to make it work. So each year it gets bigger and bigger. Your policy manuals expanded from 1 to, I think it must have half a dozen now. Mm-hmm. All the programs were the same. And suddenly we found ourselves in the same position that I think you had in Washington many years ago. Because in Washington, when I visited there, it must be 20 years ago, in their welfare office they had several manuals, and everything was done by rule. But the accounting procedures, the time taken by the social worker to fulfill all the obligations required of the manuals, to detail everything specifically to account for a particular rule or regulation, was horrendous. And our own system at the time was so simple by comparison.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm speaking from the public's or from the social worker's point of view. It's much easier if you have a limited number of rules and regulations to take into account. If you're allowed to use a little common sense, even though they're with its inherent dangers. Now we have so much that we have to handle in the form of complex regulations, formulas, and what's the word I'm looking for? Just a systems devised to account for every situation. But it really is an onerous task to get these into your mind.
Mm-hmm.
You spend half your time searching through these damn regulations just to find what you can do for someone. Whereas my initial experience had been very basic, simple set of rules that you could apply, and then for anything over and above it, you could get special consideration.
Mm-hmm.
But you now spend far too much time in this other process, and the complications are just terrible. And you still, in the end, no matter how many rules you have, you still have to use common sense in many situations.
Mm-hmm.
So you're always with that. I say this simply because I think if you look at the history and the development of our manuals and policies, we've gone far too far with it. And I think it's a shame because it's really making the whole process a heavy, heavy administrative burden. You're not helping the client as much as you're keeping books and reading regulations or changing regulations.
Mm-hmm.
It's a terrible thing. And that is dramatic. I think that in administration, that whole thing should be relooked from the point of view that you are stuck with a common sense person in the field who must use what he considers common sense at some point in time, and where to draw the line with that.
Mm-hmm.
So that the client's rights are protected, and yet the worker doesn't spend a disproportionate amount of his time on the administrative processes.
Oh, I'm thinking back to what you mentioned earlier in the interview and before the interview as well about what people learn when they go through schools of social work, or at least this particular one at UBC. Is common sense something that one can be taught, or?
No, I hardly think so. I think people come with it as they grow. But some people possibly would never have it. I guess you would agree with that.
Yeah, certainly.
But my point is that you just don't want to inflict the decisions of a civil servant on clientele necessarily. They should have their rights protected.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you can do a lot of this by, first of all, making sure your staff appointments are well considered, that your supervisor staff are well up, or they shouldn't be in there, that they have this understanding, and also, above all, have an adjudication system that will review a client's demands or their complaints. Now, there's no reason why you couldn't cover it by a decent adjudication system where the client could come to that person and the system could hear the client as well as the worker and come to what is considered a more appropriate decision.
Well, that was one of the requirements, I think, of the Canada Systems Plan. We talked earlier about the residency being eliminated as a requirement. And there was supposed to be some kind of adjudication process. Did that happen here?
Yes, but the adjudication system is a little ponderous. And again, it introduces I must speak now a few years back. It may have changed. It introduced a lot of local input. People came in from, like, the client could bring someone with them, which is fine. They should be represented. But the committee constituted not only our regional administrator, but people from the community. And often they wouldn't agree at all, but they didn't have the background or knowledge. They were really talking off the top of their heads. So their judgment in these things was really flawed. And what I'm saying is, I suppose if you have a good adjudication system, it should be some acceptable, knowledgeable people in the system who know it, understand it, have a decent appreciation of it, and they help protect the client. It's a far better way. You can't bring in outsiders and expect them to understand this damn complex business.
Mm-hmm. What impact would, in your view, did the addition of rules and regulations and policies and laws have on the morale of the staff of the department?
It's bad. You see, when I was in the field, I had felt I had everything at my fingertips. You could remember all your acts, your regulations, and philosophies, and you could work with it. Well, then it reached the point where no one had it. And I know when I worked in the buildings, you could take part in the development of it. You could write it, you could read it, you could study it and understand it at the time, and a month later you wouldn't remember it. Simply, you've got to work with this stuff to remember it. But it became so much, it was changed so often, it was added to continually, and even field staff couldn't keep up with it.
Mm-hmm.
That's how bad it got.
Mm-hmm.
And through no fault of anyone's, except that the system demanded it. You know, you had to try to have a rule set for every job. It's just not possible. What I'm suggesting is that somewhere or another, administration must be able to really look at this whole thing and bring about a compromise situation which will satisfy both and cut down on a lot of this, which I think is garbage.
Satisfy both which?
Both the needs of the clients and the administration. Because after all, if you can't satisfy the needs of people who are administering the service, that is, make it possible for them to administer sensibly and properly, the client's going to get lousy service. And also, this client must be protected, of course.
Mm-hmm.
But there has to be a midpoint. And we've gone too far from one thing now to the other.
Mm-hmm. Related to that, Bob, comes to mind a question about the principles of the practice of social work, which client determination and compassion and empathy and things like that we're taught that. We're taught that those things are important. Do you see a place for those kinds of things and other social work principles in the administration of the social program?
Oh, yes. There's, I mentioned earlier I had the opportunity of going to UVic, taking public administration, and it was very interesting because you're sitting in another professional area and viewing systems in the public service from another viewpoint. But it's purely physical. There's just, there's no room for sentiment, there's no room. Even many of the management theorists forget that they're dealing with human beings in the form of supervisors and managers. And they tend to lean far too heavily on the economy of all actions and how you translate messages up and down the line, how you give instructions to staff and so forth, but they forget the personal aspects. Now, not all. Some of the, one American author in particular was exceptionally good at recognizing the needs of persons who work in any bureaucracy.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember his name, sorry. But this is the thing that struck me.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you have an establishment which concerns itself only with the efficiency of the operations, and the favorite words now are, responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we've always had responsibility, but for some reason or other, it's assumed that it's a new thing now. And the responsibility has taken the form of every dollar is accounted for, every rule is accounted for, and if anything is done, it's done in this fashion.
Mm-hmm.
See, and it becomes terribly mechanical, and that has fostered the addition of many more words in our policy manuals. It fosters systems which are of accountability, which are overwhelmingly complex and demanding of time.
Mm-hmm.
But these are the catchphrases now that are coming out of this management process. And it's unfortunate because they're taken a little out of context and they're overused. And there's not a balance between, as I say, the human element, the servicing element, and the management.
Mm-hmm.
And there has to be a much clearer understanding of the two.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't know if I've made this clear, but you can attack specific instances and events to to show this.
Nope. An example would be helpful.
Well, in the appointing of senior staff, I think it's unfortunate in a way. You get one deputy minister, for example. He's the senior, of course, in the ministry. This word on appointments, although you have a body who panels applicants, if you're talking about senior staff, he's the one that eventually says. And some of them actually sit on the panels. And I'm not going to name names, but one specifically who appointed a number of people who were intelligent in many ways, but obviously were mechanistic in their approach, believers in everything being done and accounted for, but didn't really know what the impact would be on clientele or the staff, and they had no experience in the field or very little. So there became a very serious separation, in my estimation, between the field and senior administration. And that when you lose that, you lose an awful lot. You can't express concerns back and forth and come out with a reasonable response because the communication is poor. You'll talk, but you're really not communicating properly. And it's because of this business of choosing people who don't have that kind of feeling or understanding of what the heck is really going on, what's going on in the heads of people at the field level and the clients. Is that clear?
Yeah.
You should have a blending. You should, for example, at one time, now Vic Belknap was the superintendent of child welfare, and then he was a marvelous person at understanding the needs not only of staff but of the families. He had a good theoretical conception of what was going on in child welfare practice and programs that were needed. Very common sense, down to earth grasp of it. But administratively, he was no hot shot. Stuff would pile up in his desk and usual. But whenever you're in trouble in the field with some major issue, he was the one, and he was fantastic. Now, along with him should have been sitting,
Excuse me, I wonder if we should stop for a second.
saying that I thought here was a clear demonstration, at least in my mind, that there should have been a blending of two persons, one dealing with the administrative aspects, who knew and understood the complexity of the administrative processes, along with Vic, who would demand that certain things be maintained so that the client and the staff would be served properly. And I'm afraid we've gotten away from that to a great degree.
So often there seems to me to be an expectation that the social worker will be all things to all people.
Yes.
Perhaps in the social work administration, that's even a more severe problem.
I think that was one of the problems early on when I first started, that we were all things to all people. And it took a long time to get it through your head that that couldn't be. Now the schools were at fault, our in-service was at fault, but at least it was a positive force, but that had to be modified.
Yeah. To go back then again, the NDP was in power for a few years, and it was lots of money, and it was being spent widely. What happened when the government changed again?
Well, I think, as I say, the tax revenues peaked during that time, and then when the social credit got back in, they started slowing up. And of course, in the last 2 or 3 years of revenues dropping, they've severely cut back in services in the educational field, and a number of I just don't know how much it really impacted the welfare department, but considerably. They kept welfare rates down. They were indexed, you see, for a few years under NDP. Well, that's gone by the board. And staff have been cut, childcare staff, different services have been trimmed back. Not too, and I don't think it's that severe. I don't think they've chopped that many staff off. But a number of the programs that were instigated by NDP in the heyday had to be cut back.
What was it like for you as an administrator to have to go through the boom bust cycle?
Well, I left just before the bust came. I just left a year or two before, so I missed that. It's easy going up. It's very, very hard when you have to turn back, as you well know. But I can't say I have a personal experience with that.
Okay, I want to go back to whatever happened next, but I need to skip back again. I have time sequence here. During the time that you were, I believe it was when you were Assistant Director of Welfare, the Canada Assistance Plan
Right.
came in, I believe in 1965 or 1966. What impact did that have on you and the work that you were doing?
The unfortunate thing is, in this redistribution of tax funds, it creates administrative problems, a heavy weight of additional administrative time to deal with it, and simply so you can transfer funds, which to me seems a little strange. But along with it, of course, goes the value of a central government helping bring about rational standards across Canada. And the states have done the same thing, of course. So the immediate impact was all this extra work just to get federal funding to share in many of your programs. Now, the government at the time was very pleased with it because we brought in millions of dollars from Ottawa. But as I say, to do it on a case-by-case basis almost, which we were doing, which is still being done, I guess, seems a little heavy. It would be much better to simply, I think, take an estimate of what the revenue should be, and then pay them in the form of one check, and not have all this business of keeping records, and having their auditors go through our offices, having our regulations and our methods. We would change our policies and procedures to gain additional revenues from Ottawa. And sometimes the changes were not constructive; they were foolish ones, but we had to do it to get this money.
The requirements of Canada Assistance Plan, we mentioned earlier about residency and eliminating residency requirements and requiring an appeal process. Did those kinds of things make any difference in British Columbia?
Oh yes, they certainly did. As I say, it was the last step really in eliminating shoving people back and forth across the country. And there was a fair amount of it done. Cruel stuff, that disappeared. Now it still bubbles up in every province will complain about the cost. They've got people here from Alberta or Alberta saying they've got people from BC, but it doesn't mean the clients move, they just weaken. And that's very helpful. All these things, I just add though, but with a different kind of a process with CIP, if you're going to cost share, you can do it, you can still impose all these demands without doing it on a detailed basis. This change in legislation. Why do we give accounting on every case so we can get cost share? Why do we have to follow a lot of regulations that they impose upon us which really don't fit our particular situation just to get funding? And it's done on a detailed basis, and it's really a waste of time.
It's done on a case-by-case basis?
Well, initially that's the way it started. Now, obviously it's changing, and the bookkeeping process has taken care of it. But when I left, if you had 100 cases, they were shareable. If you had 10,000 cases, they were shareable. But there is no particular need of that. You've got a certain budget, and all you need is a percentage of that, an agreed upon percentage. You can then certainly make sure that there's an appeal process, or that there's no residency clauses. So these all take care of themselves. Health grants do that.
Pardon me?
Health grants, I think, basically do that.
Did CAP allow British Columbia to do anything that hadn't done before as far as either assistance or services go?
I mean, did it allow us to develop more services? Yeah, I think so. Because of these additional revenues, it was a good way to it was only costing 50 cents on the dollar.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was helpful that way.
Okay, and the other things that were happening during that period of time, I understand that there was probably a fair bit of negotiation between federal and provincial governments about a variety of social welfare legislation. Were you involved in that sort of thing?
It was really very painful, the meetings we used to have, and my feeling was it wasn't producing enough. You know, Ottawa had to impose certain things on us. I'm sure I can't remember all the details, but I sat in meeting after meeting and didn't produce enough to make it worthwhile. And just to exchange funds.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's if they have a great idea that will be helpful across Canada and they want to impose it, well, that's one thing. But it's the details that they seem to get into. Secondly, I found that, I don't know if CAP were aware of it, but they were playing games. For example, they'd be making concessions to Ontario and Quebec, and I was dealing with CAP for us at the time. I'd find out that they were getting cost sharing on a lot of things that we weren't. Now, the CAP officials knew it, but they never told us. You had to find out for yourself, you see, which I didn't think was quite reasonable or fair, because I was under a tremendous amount of work pressure, and I just happened to find this out when I was at a conference in Ottawa. So then we opened that area up. But the way it's administered, again, is too detailed.
Mm-hmm.
And it allows, I think, Ottawa to really play favorites from province to province. They shared, obviously, in some patterns in eastern provinces that they wouldn't do here.
Mm-hmm.
It's just this crazy game going on.
Mm-hmm.
A useless game, really, not productive.
Yeah. Would you make a comparison between federal-provincial relations along that line and provincial-regional relations in this province?
Same sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Politicians do not like to let authority go. I know at the time, Mr. Bennett's feelings about the cost share programs was not a very good one. He felt, well, all they're doing is giving back our own tax monies and then putting certain demands along with them.
Mm-hmm.
But when the municipalities needed money from the provincial government, the same thing went on. But I guess it's a political thing as much as anything. Once you have that revenue, you're not going to let it go. It's votes or whatever.
Yeah. Which Mr. Bennett was that?
WAC, that person.
Mm-hmm. After you were assistant director of welfare, Bob, you moved along to another position. What inspired you to make that change? And what were you
Well,
doing?
it's the department was restructured, and we brought an additional person into senior administration. Don Bingham happened to be, he became director of programs, and I became the director of operations. As I say, it was a restructuring process.
Mm-hmm. And were there changed responsibilities for you?
Yes, I was. I think at the time then I had only the field to deal with. The field reported through me.
And how was that for you?
Fine. Yes. I enjoyed that very much. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What kinds of issues were you having to deal with in that position?
Well, I suppose the main concern at all times was caseloads and need for more staff and resources.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a continual problem of interpretation, of arguing with government, and trying to fulfill the requirements of the field, and also help the field understand why the limitations in order that they not be too frustrated.
Mm-hmm.
The social workers have a tremendous need to continually develop and consume more and more resources. I guess we're notorious spenders of government revenues. If you allow a social worker too much leeway, we can spend money very, very quickly. That's very true. We see no end to it because we're identifying needs in the community that we think are important. So that frustration was always there. People that were workers that are working with people in the community, helping them deal with their problems, trying to meet their financial needs, etc., are under tremendous strain, and they're always identifying the need for more resources. And so you must deal with this consistently, daily. And it's always on the roster. Phone calls from the field. Half the time you're on the phone is dealing with that specific thing in one way, shape, or another.
How did it feel to be the man in the middle?
Well, you don't mind if you feel you can be helpful interpreting. You know, you must assume some responsibility, of course. There's no use saying, oh, well, I'm not responsible. So you try and take the government side and interpret it positively. I felt it was very important because when I worked in the field, I knew that meant a tremendous amount to me. If you understood what was going on, you could work with comfort then within the limit of the regulations. And as I say, this probably still is one of the main concerns in the field. Also, another thing would be dealing with policy to keep it as brief as possible and as clear as possible. Always the written word is never quite up to what it should be. So this was constantly under review, under criticism and change.
Mm-hmm. Bob, in the way you describe yourself and the way that you've done your work, and from the understanding that I have about how some provincial governments, anyway, provincial departments of social services have placed emphasis on efficiency and management procedures and things like that. I wonder if you were a bit of a fish out of water for a time there. That's just something I'm wondering about.
Yeah, I think perhaps it was less. I felt I was a fish out of water when it came to understanding all of our knowing and remembering all of our policy. It got so ponderous. I felt a terrible lack there. And I felt some comfort when I learned that the regional managers in the field had also lost touch with it. You know, you felt, oh, well, join the club. But not so much in the management area. There was later, just before I left, there was a frustration that we had lost kind of the personal touch.
Mm-hmm.
The department had got too big. We had far too many people working in the buildings, far too many people writing policy. It just became kind of a massive moving organism that had no personality to it anymore. What is the word I'm looking for? No feeling so much. It was too mechanized, too ponderous. That was what I thought was a serious lack. You know, once it becomes like that, people slips away. They can't. For example, people worked very willingly overtime. Never gave a button, never got a dime for it, never got time off for it or anything. But it was part of your job, you just accepted it.
That was when you began.
Yeah. Now a worker can't do that. The union demands they be paid for it or get compensated with time off. But it takes away a lot of steam out of the job. It's not yours anymore.
Mm-hmm.
You're running by rule. And you lose a lot from that, a surprising amount of that, in fact, because your own personal input is being challenged, shall we say, or restricted.
Mm-hmm. And the place of common sense that we've mentioned a couple of times. There's not enough place for that anymore.
No. It's terribly. We're talking about morale, but and I think in social work it's terribly important. I guess it's important in everything, whether it's manufacturing or whatever. And it has slipped away. And I feel that here's where management must attack this very firmly and strongly. There's ways of dealing with it, of course.
Are there ways of dealing it within huge bureaucracies and in the ministry, for
Yes,
example?
I think so. If huge bureaucracies become burdensome, in a sense, because of a lack of or an inability to localize things or to set aside, take some authority out of your own hands and place it with others. Place trust and authority in their hands. That helps tremendously because once they have that authority, they understand it. They understand its limitations, the reasons, the rationale for it. They can administer it far better. They're doing it. They defer to you. But I think in large bureaucracies there's too much of a tendency to retain controls at the top and leaving a little leeway down below.
Mm-hmm. And the element of trust.
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm. When did you leave the position as director of field operations, and where did you go then?
Oh, well, it stayed in the building again. It was under NDP. The administrative staff in the Parliament buildings just really went very, very quickly. And senior staff was increased. Of course, the field operation was huge. How many offices we have throughout the province, but a great number. And so that was divided up. So there became 3 executive directors, each one assuming responsibility for a section of the province. So my job was then limited to a section. But then as well as that, you took responsibility for some divisions. And then we rotated responsibility from one area of the province to another. Annually, we would change places as to what area we would cover and what divisions we would cover, so that you weren't with the same group all the time.
Bob, pardon me if I'm being perhaps more direct than I should, but was that a lateral move for you?
Oh, yes. Yeah, it was actually the salaries went up, but yes, it was a lateral. My basic responsibility of covering the whole province was divided into 3.
Mm-hmm.
But instead of having a program manager in the form of Don Bingham, he too took a section of the province plus a division. That's what I did. So it's more of a lateral thing, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
Fortunately, at the time, we got bigger salary increments, which was
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And how long were you in that position?
well, until I retired.
When was that?
So 3 years ago now, I guess.
Uh-huh.
I lose all track. Yeah. Yeah, it's about 3 years.
Okay. Perhaps I can move now to some more general questions than I have been asking. One of which would be sort of a long-term perspective. Over the years, what would you say are the most significant changes that have affected public welfare in British Columbia? What's your opinion on that?
Well, I think there's been a marvelous improvement in the attitude of, I say this with some limitations, of course, but the understanding of the needs of poor people. I think. Because what I saw just toward the end of the war wasn't really very pleasant. The administration of public assistance was localized. It was horrible. The attitudes were very, very bad. It took several years to get rid of it all.
Mm-hmm.
But they improved markedly. And the new social assistance legislation that came along was positive, clear, and of course our economy was growing, made it much easier. So in spite of the limitations of the public assistance grants, the improvement in administration plus the rates wasn't that bad.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a long way to go, but it made great strides. Certainly in my time I saw it happen.
Mm-hmm.
And then the recognition of the needs of children, that too took place. We came out of an era when not too much time and attention was paid, or constructive, knowledgeable attitudes toward the problems of kids in trouble. And I can't say we've made any great strides in correcting it, but I sure think we've made improvements for a great number of kids that we've provided care for.
Mm-hmm.
And also keeping families together. But what we have done is recognize far more of these problems that exist and were really hidden before.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's at least a good step forward.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, too, when I first started, they had the old age pensions for people. Now, of course, the universal old age security. Yeah, when you look back, there have been a tremendous number of improvements.
During those years, I wonder if there are, moving more specifically now to your achievements and interests, I wonder if there are accomplishments of which you're particularly proud.
I'm not sure I get your question.
Things that you've done that you're particularly happy about.
suppose one of the greatest satisfactions was being regional manager, because when you feel you have an area of definite responsibility and you're working on your own, you're almost your own boss to a certain extent. And hopefully you don't carry this to a point where you become a little dictator. But I felt rather quite happy and satisfied that I had the confidence of the staff, and I could make it as easy for them to do a job as anyone could. You know, I just felt quite comfortable in the position, and the response I could get from the staff was considerable. So that was perhaps the most rewarding to me.
What about regrets?
Yes, sometimes I wish that, once you move up the scale or up the ladder, it's very hard to step back. I didn't have the guts to do that. Or I think I would have, because I found the buildings were stifling. You get sick of sitting in smoke-filled rooms, meeting after meeting, regurgitating the same stuff, hearing the same stuff, going through one minister after the other. It deadens the soul. And without the field, I don't think I could have sustained it. But I didn't want to step back. Probably my fault.
Yeah.
But I think I would have liked to stay. So that would be my life.
Yeah. I wonder if being a social worker has had particular meaning for you. Has it meant something to you to be a social worker?
Oh yeah, I hate the word social worker, I always remember a fellow I knew years ago out of the Navy, and he said he hated it too. It reminded him of a busy little bee. But yeah, it was a very pleasant thing to be doing something you like doing, and hopefully it was helpful to people you were serving and were being paid for it. My God, the salaries were low, extremely low, but it was very satisfying work. If I had it to do over, I'd do the same thing.
Well, that's quite an accolade in itself.
Yeah. Mind you, I think I hit it at a time when it was a very happy experience in the field. Lots of work, but as they say, the morale was. I bet Bill Crosby probably said the same thing.
Yeah, he was pretty enthusiastic.
Yeah.
Anything you'd like to add, Bob?
Can't
Parting thoughts, sort of?
Can't think just offhand. No, it's just that I suppose in this time of retrenchment, if staff can learn to live with that, here again, I would imagine, I'm just surmising this, that if the administration could do one thing, it would be to really sit down with field staff and interpret this continually over the next months. And I mean, you can't say it once and expect it to be taken. You've got to continually interpret and reinterpret. And let them have a feeling that retrenchment isn't all bad, that you can live with it, and you can go out of it again. Because it's imperative that it be done. There's just nothing else. If your revenues have fallen off, if you don't have the funds, well, you cannot sustain the same program that you've had. But it's this acceptance of it, and I think right now, I'll bet the field need that very, very badly. The thing is that as you well know, when you're working in the field, you don't have an appreciation. You're young, you're new, you don't have an appreciation for what it means to be a minister. You're after revenues, which are very sorely needed elsewhere. So you've got to be able to put up a great fight. You don't have the sympathy of other ministers, if you like, for the cabinet. So you're limited. And I don't think many of the field staff really appreciate that. They're out of hand, you condemn the deputy or the minister. And there again, communication is so important that they learn to trust and identify the person, know that something is positive is happening, that there are these limitations. Because when you live in frustration of it, you're wasting energy and time. Isn't that true? You won't accept it, you keep fighting it, and you're really wasting your energies. And it's not at all productive. And it's a shame. It's very destructive.
Yeah, and the energy could be used for something else.
But you have, we're talking about morality, but That's so important. It's just the business. You can't educate and expect to hire intelligent, well-trained people and then keep them in the dark about the whys and wherefores of things. It's not intentionally done, but it is done. It happens.
Mm-hmm.
From that, I can't think of anything else.
Okay. Well, and in closing, I'd like to thank you very much for being with us this afternoon and sharing your thoughts and
Well,
recollections.
I hope the thoughts have been clear enough. Sometimes I think they get a little muddled.
No, you've made sure that that I've understood, and this unknown third party that will watch and read this sometime.
Yeah.
It'll be clear for them too.
Yeah.
So
Well,
thanks
thank
very
you.
much.